I'd like to welcome everybody to today's seminar, webinar 2022, Time for a New Beginning. I don't know if those are the appropriate words, but I think it's been 18 months, 16 months since we had our first webinar with Peter. And I think a lot of people have participated on a regular basis and quite enjoy them. So I was speaking with Peter about 3 weeks ago and asked him if he was ready to go again. And he thought it would be appropriate time to given the election that is coming up. And he suggested that it might be appropriate that we have his son, Mark Andersen, who's a managing director at Slalom, who is a cloud-based work productivity digitization expert. And I think it ties in quite well with the business cycle and the things that people are going to need to do to be competitive during the rest of this business cycle. For those of you that don't know Peter Andersen, he's a PhD grad from Harvard. He taught at the University of Texas when he retired. He lives in Austin, Texas. He grew up in Canada and spent a part of his career at Woods Gordon, which became Ernst & Young. He's spent time in a very senior role at the Bank of Canada. And today he still consults with some of Canada's more successful family enterprises. So without much further ado, I will allow Peter to introduce himself and start with his presentation. Thank you.
Jason, thank you very much. And for those on the line, I want to thank you very much for your time. It's a pleasure and an honor to be able to spend time with you and exchange ideas. Let me get right to the point. Let me get to the punchline. I think this is going to be a longer economic expansion. I think that it will go past mid-decade, but it doesn't mean that it's going to be smooth sailing. I think we're going to see bumps along the way, and I think that there are going to be a lot of issues that as business leaders that you're going to have to contend with. One of the big issues that we all face right now is, where is inflation headed? And what I'm hearing from the people that I talk to is that we're worried. So many of us expect inflation to be more than 3%. In fact, I would say that the majority of people that I have talked to expect inflation to be 3% or higher, and that there is a sizable number of people who expect inflation to be 4% or higher. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean the years 2022 and 2023. I don't mean right now today, but this is so important because it means inflation will be driving interest rates, and interest rates will be driving the length of the business cycle, and they will also be driving the actions of our central banks. You have seen what the Federal Reserve was talking about at its last meeting. The minutes became available yesterday, and you have seen clearly how the stock market has reacted to that. There's an old saying on Bay Street, don't fight the Fed. And one of the reasons for high stock market valuations and high returns in stocks, one of the reasons for that has been this very aggressive central bank policy of liquefying the financial system and buying lots and lots of government bonds. And the talk about tapering, even before the end of this year, was enough to send the stock market into quite a bit of a change. So we can expect to see volatility going ahead. My bottom line, though, is a positive outlook. I'm thinking this year, 6% growth, and I'm talking non-inflationary growth. And next year, something like 4% growth before we settle down to the trend rate which I think is going to be a better trend than we saw over the last decade. In fact, I think that productivity is going to play a big part. It's going to be the game changer, really, in how this business cycle performs. Let me quickly go into some of the components of this inflation issue. First of all, we have fundamental demand and supply. And the story here is that we will be looking at full capacity, and I paused here to emphasize the point, first quarter of 2023. That's when I expect the unemployment rates on both sides of the border to be getting down to full employment. So that's when you can see a persistent demand supply pressure on inflation, 2023, but not right now. And then we have the base effect. The base effect is coming from the depressed levels of this time last year, April, May, June, July of last year, to where we are now. And in many cases, that is just the restoration of previous price levels. It looks bad, it looks scary, but it doesn't look to me as if it's going to be sustained, this base effect. I think it'll be out of the system by early 2022. In fact, if you go back to 2019 and get the 2-year inflation rate from then until now, which rules out this base period jump, the inflation trend is something like a 3% trend. Still high, but it's nothing like the 4 to 5% that people are worried about. And then the last component is the supply chain disruptions. And I think these supply chain disruptions are going to be meaningful and will be with us for longer than we would like. Because what I want to warn my Canadian friends is that we are in deep trouble in the United States with the Delta variant. We had 158,000 new cases nationally yesterday. Just to give you some perspective on that, Jason, when I was putting my July economic report together, I wrote down 32,000 as the trend in new cases. That was in my draft version. By the time I came to finish my July economic report, the number was running at 76,000. Today, it's running at 158,000. So that is something that can easily slip north of the border as well. Canada is still looking good. I mean, in June, we got down to only 412 cases per day in June, 7-day average. But now we're up again. We're up at something like, just under 2,500 new cases a day. Not as bad as the 8,600 at our peak, but still beware. And I think it's going to have a supply chain impact. So the bottom line, everyone, is that inflation is going to be a big time worry for some time. And I guess that I want to go back now to kind of one of my favorite subjects, psychology. Anybody study psychology at university? Well, I just want to remind everyone that we are not rational people. It's not human nature to be rational. We are hardwired to have biases. And one of them is a negativity bias. We tend to put, if we have an equal amount of bad news and an equal amount of good news, Jason, we tend to put the emphasis on the bad news, even though it's kind of equally weighted in terms of the amount of news we're getting on each side of the story. I guess the other thing is we tend to have an anchoring bias. That's part of human nature. We tend to get anchored to a certain point of view. And also we have a confirmation bias. We seek out news that confirms the anchoring that we have in our thinking. So that's where I want to point out that we have to be really flexible here, and we have to be open to the data. We have to be open to what the data is telling us. So this is where I want to look at some of the data. And in chart 1, Kelly, it's time to go to chart 1. That's my slide on inflation. And I'm showing you the Canadian number here. This is Canada's Consumer Price Index. And you'll notice the heading, it's trimmed. What we've done is we've cut out the extremes. We've cut out 20% of the tail on the upside and 20% of the tail on the downside. So Jason, what we're looking at here is what's in the middle. We're looking at the middle of the distribution of price changes. And so the story here isn't all that bad. We're up at 2.6. We've been there for 2 months. But hold on, yesterday we got an update. I didn't get it into the diagram, but for the month of July, we're up to 3.1. It's still not the 4% or 5%, but looking at the central tendency of price changes, you can see it's still something to worry about and something that we have to deal with. Now, I guess what I want to do is mention that the consumer price index basket doesn't change. When things get expensive, the basket doesn't take allowance for people substituting away from expensive things. In the United States, we have something that does cover this substitution. It's called the PCE, Personal Consumption Expenditure Index. And what that shows is that inflation is only 2%, 1.95% actually, the latest number that we have. And it was actually higher pre-pandemic. So in the United States, if you allow for substitution, you know, when lettuce gets too expensive, you switch to cabbage, right? So let's not measure the price of expensive lettuce. Let's take a look at what's been substituted for us. And so that's what the more flexible PCE trimmed measure it gives us in the United States. Now, we've heard a lot about wages. You know, I have a friend in the restaurant business, and he says, Peter, I've gone from paying $14 to $15 an hour for my restaurant staff to something like $21 to $22 with $500 to $1,000 sign-on bonuses. Well, that's an example of bad news. But if you look at the data, what we have shows that the compensation trend in the United States, adjusted for industries and occupations so that you don't get a shifting mix that obscures the trend, it's coming in at 2.8%. 2.8%. But remember, that's before we look at what productivity could do. A few more things. The bond market is giving us a message too. The bond market is telling us that 10-year money is going at 1.24%. There's supposed to be an inflation risk factor in that 10-year bond yield. And the bond market is not worried about inflation. In fact, we've got an even better way of looking at the bond market. If we take a look at the actual 10-year interest rate, this is on US Treasuries, and we look at the inflation adjusted real 10-year Treasury yield and take the difference, obviously the market rate will be higher than the real rate because the real rate protects investors from inflation. So what's the difference? The difference is what the bond market thinks inflation will average over the next 10 years. And as of yesterday, the number is 2.32%. So that's what the bond market is telling us inflation will average over the next 10 years, 2.32%. Over the next 5 years, it's about the same. And then finally, we've got commodities, Jason. Let's just take a look at what's happened with commodity prices. Oil prices right now are the lowest since last May, okay? Below $65 on oil. In fact, the price this morning is $63.38 on oil. On July the 13th, we were at $75 on the price of oil. And I could go into other things too. I could go into copper, I could go into lumber, I could go into zinc and go into nickel. All of those commodities prices have come down since June, July into where we are now towards just past the middle of August. So those are some numbers that are some of the good news numbers that say, don't get too upset about what's going on with inflation. Okay, let's take a look at the next slide. The next slide has the word productivity in it. And what's happening in the United States? This is, by the way, a big picture view. The reason I'm not showing the Canadian number is we don't actually have the Canadian number to show you yet. So I wanted to show you as of mid-year that productivity growth is running at a good clip in the United States. In fact, it's faster than you would normally expect coming out of a business recession. A 2.3% growth in the second quarter, 4.3 in the first. So even though you might have a compensation trend of 2.8 to 3%, adjust that by output per hour, and unit labor costs are not a problem. We don't have cost push inflation because we have such good productivity performance. So what I'm saying is, this is the game changer, everyone. Productivity is going to be the game changer. The companies that are out there are making big investments in new technology. I can see that in the government data. And in particular, a different kind of investment, not in so much in the hard goods end, but in intellectual property, in software investments. And we do have numbers for that, and they're really impressive. So it could be that the pandemic has caused a historical inflection point. It's been a crisis, and the crisis has caused changes to take place. Trends that were already in place prior to the pandemic, I think, have really been accelerated. And we have new forms of working that are happening everywhere in all industries, even the post office. I applied today for my renewed passport application, and I did it all online. I did it with the post office. I filled out everything online, and I even let them know when the mailman should arrive to take the package. So no more lineups for me in crowded post offices. So and the same thing with telehealth as well. There's so many industries where this has been affected. I think the supply chain is such a big one, though, because of the pandemic, and the pandemic is certainly still with us with the Delta variant. The pandemic has really caused a focus on how do we revolutionize and change the supply chain. So many parts to it. It's a complicated system. We need to have a just-in-case kind of supply chain that gives us security and responsiveness, and it's all there as a possibility. So what I see happening, everyone, is that this diagram that shows the productivity performance, I think it's going to give us a higher trend rate of productivity in this business cycle than what we saw in the last one. And it's going to be a shift to an online economy across the board in all sectors. My final slide is the sense of urgency. Take a look at job vacancies. This is what's happening with unfilled positions. And you can see we have over 10 million unfilled positions in the United States. These are positions that are actively being worked on. There's active recruitment taking place for these positions. It cuts across really all parts of the workforce, but it shows the urgency. We have never been this high since this data series began in 2000, in the year 2000. And look at the change in such a short period of time. So this is giving a real imperative to companies to adapt and to do something about this, to organize themselves in such a way that they can work in a more less labor intensive and in a more productive labor saving situation. So Jason, that's my comment. I talked longer than I wanted. I was aiming at 15 minutes. I think I've gone over 20. My apologies. Back to you.
Thanks, Peter. I have a couple questions, and I will ask those, and anybody else that has questions, if they could please submit them through chat. I'll collect them, and when Mark is finished, Peter will still be here, and Mark and Peter will answer questions for a period of time. Peter, when you talk about the business cycle and productivity affecting it and inflation, a couple of the things that I've thought about is we have a generation of workers who don't know what inflation is. And if I go back 20 years, inflation has been relatively low. Mortgages have been almost free. How is inflation? How are they going to deal with inflation on a go-forward basis?
No, Jason, that is a great question. It is going to be a sea change in the environment, even in a best case situation. My rule of thumb is that we're going to be operating come 2022, 2023 in an inflation world where inflation is running at something like 2 to 3%. And let's just pick a number to be safe. Let's say 2.5%, 2.75%. That is an enormous change from the last 10 years. Over the last 10 years, we were running at something like 1.7% annual average, 10-year annual average, 1.7% inflation. So I suppose that with more inflation, you know, to me, it means we have more volatile stock markets. It means that you are going to be nervous some days when you take a look at what the stock market is doing in response to rising inflation and what the central banks are doing about it. When it comes to borrowing, it does mean that mortgages are going to be more expensive. We're not going to be able to get the cheap mortgages that we have been used to getting. And I guess in terms of just mainly all household related expenses are going to become more of an issue. And probably what happens, Jason, is that wages are not going to necessarily keep up with this inflation in the first instance. So we have come from an era where low inflation has given buying power. I think that rising inflation is going to be maybe a drain on buying power for many people who don't have the ability to ratchet their wages up in step with inflation.
A second question is, I have a significant number of clients who are being largely affected by the supply chain and the ability of the global transportation system to deliver. And a container 12 months ago, 14 months ago, might have been $3,500. And the average delivery was 40 days. That container now can cost $21,500 and take 80 or 90 days. And climate change is beginning to affect it because of the level of waters in the harbor in Boston and New York. And I've read in a transportation newsletter that some ships are just bypassing certain ports in China because the wait is too long. How do you believe this transportation, shipping lane problem is going to affect productivity and inflation and the supply chain cycle? Mark or Peter, you're both welcome to answer.
Well, let me just give a quick answer. What I'm finding from a lot of the client contacts that I have is that people are really worried about refilling their inventory systems because of the volatility in prices. And I can't give you a better example than lumber prices. Lumber peaked at $1,600 per thousand board feet a couple of months ago. It's now running under $500 per thousand board feet. Still expensive. I mean, a normal price would be $300 to $350 per thousand board feet. But Jason, what if you had rushed into a buy program for lumber at $1,600 per thousand board feet, and now the price is down to $450 and you still haven't sold what you bought at 1,600. So that's one comment. Let me give it back to you on that.
Well, and using lumber as an example, and I'll go to the housing market and I'll go to renovation market. And it has had a big boom in the last 14 or 16 months. Given the increase in inflation and the instability in prices and the ability to deliver on time, what impact is that going to have on the housing market?
It's already having an impact, Jason. What I sense, and especially in the United States, is that we have an affordability crisis in housing. And I know that the millennials are moving into their prime home buying years, but they can't afford to buy the homes. So what I see is that new home sales in the United States have fallen off a cliff. It's no longer a V-shaped recovery in new home sales. It's the high prices that have cut back the demand. The demand is still there, but people are waiting. So one quick answer is that the solution for high prices, Jason, is high prices themselves. High prices have a way of pulling back demand and increasing supply as well. It takes a bit longer to increase supply, but it does happen over time. So that is, I think, what's happening in housing. I think that there is a cooling off that's taking place. However, the Delta variant is very much with us in the United States. I really fear that it's coming to Canada. So what the pandemic has done for housing markets, it will continue to do this for some time. I think it will continue to drive buyers out to smaller centers, and it will continue to underline the importance of work from anywhere, business conditions and business styles.
Okay, thanks, Peter. We're going to switch to Mark now, and Mark got his started. I always got to give somebody that worked in the same organization that I started at. I started at Andersen 40 years ago, and Mark worked at Andersen or Accenture and got good training and moved to Slalom, where he started that business in Canada. And I think no one better to talk about digitization, cloud-based accounting and systems, and remote working, and is it a hybrid? Is it going back to the way it was? So I'll turn it over to Mark. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Jason, and hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. As Jason said, I work for an organization called Slalom Consulting, and our focus, we're a modern consulting company, and we're focused on helping clients with technology and strategy and business transformation. So what I thought I would do today is share some of the themes and some of the observations of working with our clients and some of the challenges that they're working through, but directly with a tie back to business productivity and their ability to kind of stay nimble and stay agile throughout. So, I've got three themes or 3 points that that I want to unpack here over the next little while. One of them is around data and data-driven cultures. The other, which I think is in somewhat kind of closely related, is that a lot of business transformation for our clients is being enabled by the cloud and cloud computing capabilities that we've seen, in the past decade. And the third, I want to bring this all together with what we're seeing with the future of work and the hybrid model that in some cases we're just now starting to experience, and what the impacts we see towards productivity. Okay, so first, the first theme around data and data-driven cultures, what we see is that businesses that have this data-driven culture embedded within their organization, they're seeing these major productivity advantages over their competitors. Organizations that are really leading the pack they're making these major investments in skills like data, data scientists. I mean, the data scientist role, I think, has been kind of called many things over many generations, but now it's a very much an applied skill set. Dad, when you were showing that spike in excess sort of the labor, right? These labor needs over 10 million. I think there's a combination of maybe some entry level or retail and hospitality type jobs, but I know from our experience that there's an absolute war for talent right now on the high end, and these are the new jobs of the future. I have 3 young boys, and I always wonder what they're going to do for their career, and that keeps me up at night. And I think some of the jobs that they might be in the future may not even exist yet. I think one of them around data science is absolutely front and center. So what we're seeing is organizations making investments around artificial intelligence, in machine learning, just they're all up data and analytics capabilities. And the challenge that these data scientists are trying to crack through is to uncover actionable insights that are going to power their business, right? And in things like manufacturing, organizations are spending considerable efforts on things like predictive maintenance, right? Like they're trying to build machine learning models and algorithms that are going to tell them when their equipment is coming near end of life or needs to be proactively maintained, right? So to limit the amount of in-field activity of their teams and just go to the stuff that's about to break when they reasonably predict it's going to break. In retail, many of our clients, are working on supply chain and inventory optimization. All of these sort of actionable insights are coming from these teams of, in many cases, data scientists and software engineers. So, we're also seeing, at least here in Canada, the Canadian government has set up a supercluster, one of which is based, there are 5 superclusters, right? $1 billion in investment funding was put aside and spread across these 5 agencies. One of those 5 is purely dedicated to artificial intelligence and helping organizations with seed money to drive AI-powered solutions and creating new jobs. The organization is called Scale AI. It's based in Montreal. It's a client of ours, and they have a very interesting mix of small to medium businesses, and in some cases enterprise businesses, academia, organizations like us, right, that kind of work in partnerships to drive these next generations of AI and machine learning solutions. So I think our governments are putting their their money where their mouth is, and many of these organizations are taking these solutions, empowering themselves far further than they have in the past. Let me change gears a little bit, and again, happy to take any questions on any of these, but I want to kind of cover all 3 in a relatively short period of time. Business transformation enabled by cloud. The pandemic was a real catalyst for a trend that had already, in many ways had been going for several years, well over a decade, right? The technology, major tech companies, and major public clouds like Google and Amazon and Salesforce and Microsoft, I'm leaving off Microsoft, right? They've been making major investments in their cloud computing technologies. What we saw at the pandemic, it was a real tipping point for businesses to adopt these technologies and move a lot of their technology stack off of their historic and legacy infrastructure, like their information technology infrastructure, and move it into the cloud, right, into cloud computing. And a couple of things have happened when in a move like that. One is that the organizations have taken the opportunity to take old applications or older enterprise applications that were powering their business, when they moved them to the cloud, they wouldn't just, we sometimes call it lift it and shift it, right? They're, in many cases, have been lifting it and shining it, right, on the way, and then improving those applications that are driving their business. So, you know, those organizations, I think represent, in some cases, legacy organizations that are trying to keep pace with some of the new modern ways of working with technology. In other cases, we've seen a lot of new organizations just born, you know, they're native cloud companies, we call them, and they are, you know, they were born in the cloud. They're all of their software and all of their internal, you know, business applications, all of those, all that information that they use, that is all that's all in the brand new stuff. It's all the software as a service solutions. So, you know, we're seeing a real kind of, in some cases, there's a group that's playing catch up. In other case, there are organizations that are leapfrogging. In both cases, you know, they are all taking advantage of the agility and the lower costs that cloud computing offers. And, you know, the innovation that Microsoft and Amazon and Google, that they are plowing into their products, those are in many ways kind of becoming democratized. Everyone has access to those same tools, and they don't need to have their own innovative in-house teams coming up with, you know, those aren't differentiators for them. It's how those technologies are applied that differentiates people in their business. So, so we've certainly seen a huge boost there, and like I said, a ton of productivity and a ton of agility. You know, a good example is how quickly some organizations were able to switch their, you know, their retailing business model to curbside pickup, right? I mean, it sounds like a relatively straightforward thing to do. Okay, all of a sudden, you know, I buy online, I pick up in store. Well, you know, that connection between the retailer and its e-commerce website to its, you know, its inventory management system to the actual retail brick and mortar, which is now, you know, transferred into more like a warehouse for distribution rather than a shopping experience. You know, in some cases they needed to build new applications really quickly to pick and pack and fulfill those you know, those orders. So, you know, some organizations were able to pivot on a dime, and I think cloud computing really led the way for that. In other cases, right, other organizations took a long time to try to react, and in some cases didn't make it. So the last topic that I wanted to touch on is really is our point of view around the future of work. And you know, what we're seeing is that the future of work is becoming is very much a hybrid model, and you know, I think it exists on a spectrum. I think maybe, you know, previously there were expectations that all of, say, knowledge workers anywhere were fully on site and fully present. You know, the other end of that spectrum is that everybody works remotely and everyone's working and collaborating in a digital way. I mean, here we are all on Zoom. We're all in our, you know, some of us in our cars, some of us are in our kitchens. I'm here in my basement here in Toronto. You know, these toolings have allowed for this kind of work. Now, there's some hybrid hypothesis in the middle, which talks about, you know, are some organizations remote friendly? Are they, you know, remote first? And the nuance there is, you know, the expectations on the workforce and the expectations on your team members. You know, before, honestly, if everyone was in a conference room and one person was on a Polycom or on the phone, you know, they kind of got shortchanged. And you know, we're seeing that is actually probably going to be much different about our ways of working in the future, and how we collaborate as a group. I think there's been what we also saw at the beginning of the pandemic was just a massive spike in individual productivity. We've seen all kinds of reports, and our clients have certainly told us this. We've experienced it in our own business that people are starting work earlier. They're working more condensed and more distilled hours, like the productivity within a work hour is far greater. You're not taking, say, coffee breaks, or you're not going into a food court, or just bumping into an individual if you're not in an office. And people are working much later. And so, Microsoft, I mentioned them earlier, they have an incredible source of data on people's productivity. They saw this massive uptick in their video conferencing and their collaboration products, and they've been able to track that and trace it right back to early March of last year. What we're anticipating is that productivity, that workforce productivity, I mean, we've seen productivity go way up. We have seen burnout go way up, and we've actually seen innovation kind of come way down. And what we mean by that is, the abilities for teams to kind of co-create and collaborate on the future and the forward-looking ideas has been stunted and limited. We believe that a lot of that is sort of human-centered interactions that needs to pick back up again for organizations to be proactive about what's next, right? I think the productivity was what was right in front of us, and our teams have kind of been all working, like our teams and organizations have all been working on sort of what's immediately right here. But we believe that the future of work needs to be getting people back together and co-creating and collaborating for the future and for what's next. And that's hard. That's something that's going to require like a very thoughtful and planned step. It's not we all just somehow kind of come back together into an office environment or a hybrid environment and just expect our teams to keep that level of productivity and drive net new innovation. So I'm going to pause there, and the last thing I guess I would say is that I've included there. I mean, you need it's an eye chart to read them, but what I might do is just drop these URLs that I've put underneath data-driven culture and future of work. At Slalom, we've invested significant amount of knowledge and thought capital into these ideas, and there's much more to read on those topics on our .com website. This was my hot take on these themes and my perceptions of them, but there's also more to read if anyone is interested.
Okay, thanks very much, Mark. I've got 2 or 3 questions. The floor is still open for those people to submit questions through chat. Sure. But how, before COVID, we had a very hours-based, visual-based measurement system. And what I've been reading is there is going to be a real trend towards productivity. Mm-hmm. And so with flexible hours and remote work and collaborative work, and I almost believe that productivity is the best measurement of success. What's going to happen to organizations who do not embrace the productivity model?
Yeah, there's probably a nested answer in there. One of which, there's an explicit war for talent right now. And I mean, there always has been, but for the knowledge worker, war for talent is a very aggressive war. And what we're seeing is that people are speaking with their feet, right? And if they aren't being armed with the toolings they need, or been giving the trust to allow towards to individuals to kind of produce the results and the outcomes that they want, if they're sort of being micromanaged on their day-to-day and expected to say come to an office when they prefer to work remote, they'll speak with their feet and they will leave and find another job. And we're finding that the addressable market for this skilled labor has now become global, right? I have plenty of Canadian colleagues and people in my network who have taken jobs with American firms, with firms in Europe, and they're able to work whenever they want and however they want, and collaboration tools are all enabled for them to be a part of that team. I think that maybe your other question, or sort of the second part of that question is, what's the end result of a company or an organization who allows for productivity to start to slip, like individual productivity. Do I have that right? Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's what we see is that other parts of the business will sometimes overcompensate, right? And will try to keep up to a point, like to a breaking point, at which point, eventually there's, people can't keep up. But what we're forecasting, at least around for the future of work, is that I'm trying to, the best way to sort of say this, just that, individuals are kind of inherently productive, and they are searching for the culture that is the most meaningful to them. We've seen, and there's certainly a lot of press around this and writing about this, but we're seeing certainly this next generation coming up. They will be hyper productive and want to work for organizations where they believe in the purpose and they believe in the why of the organization, and they're willing to sort of work days, nights, and weekends to be a part of those organizations where they feel connected with that purpose. So I think it's not enough to just offer the salary and not enough to just offer the tools. I think the sort of next generation is going to put pressure on organizations to lead with purpose, right? And to be focused on not just making profits, but also solving for more important things. And that's actually, like we've seen, has been a big driver of individual productivity.
With respect to the search for talent,
Mm-hmm.
in the last 12 months, I have seen what I believe acquisitions take place, not so much for the client base, but for the employees.
Yeah.
And the larger companies, professional service organizations saying, yeah, you have $25 million worth of revenue, $30 million worth of revenue, but you also got 150 employees. And it's more about the talent and the acquisition of those employees,
Mm-hmm.
actually buying the EBITDA.
Yeah. Yeah, my perspective on that, and so, well, as it relates to professional services firms, the multiple on an acquisition for a professional services firm is relatively low, and I think the reason why historically, you'll pay for the founders, or you pay for the leadership team to come across. They tend to get paid. Their team, who maybe didn't have any equity on it, if they don't feel like there's a culture fit to this new organization, or they feel like, they were acquired for their talents, but they don't feel the fit, right? They liked the small, nimble, 100-person software shop. Some of those key individuals, they pick up and leave, right? And they go off and start their own thing. The principals get paid, and when their vesting period is done, sometimes they leave, and you're left with the parts of the organization maybe that you weren't aspiring towards, which might just be the middle, right? Some of the bottom performers and the middle performers. Now we've seen this over and over again, and I mean it's an exciting thing to see a new company spin up like that, but often acquisitions in professional services don't work as seamlessly as intended. We've seen a lot of acquisitions right now in our space around digital acquisitions, meaning agencies, people who are in sort of digital media. These are all kind of complementary skill sets that, say a lot of the big 5 consultancies have been acquiring, and they have to work really hard to make those cultures fit. And often what they do is they'll ring fence those businesses and say, hey, we need your expertise, but we don't want you to be a part. We don't want you to become us. We want you to stay you. Keep your hoodies, keep your skateboards, and your cool way of working. Like that's what we bought or we're investing in.
But really what they've done is they've already acknowledged that the old method of integration is going to do more damage than good.
Mm-hmm.
It's I have another question for Peter, and it wouldn't be right to have one of these discussions about inflation, monetary policy, interest rates, without talking about Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and which cryptocurrency is going to rule the world.
Mhm. Well, I've always been interested in economic history, Jason, and also in the history of monetary systems and banking. And we are seeing an evolution here that really started centuries ago when we went from exchanging hard assets like coins, and when we saw the introduction of paper money as a substitute for gold and silver coins. And then, of course, with Elon Musk and PayPal, we saw the kind of digitization of an exchange from credit cards to PayPal. And so it looks like cryptocurrency is not going away. And having said that, I don't understand it at all. You understand it more than I do, I'm sure. It is a tremendous speculative part of the investment market at the present time. But I'd also like to add in, Jason, that a number of people that I've known for years, the way I've known you for years, have really surprised me by telling me that they have been sizable players personally in cryptocurrency investments, and to their pleasure, have done quite well. So I'll leave it at that. I don't want to risk my retirement savings with cryptocurrency investments, but it's something to deal with. For the life of me, I don't know how you can control a monetary system if you're a central bank, but I'm sure the central banks want to find out too. And they're spending, I think, considerable research resources themselves on trying to figure out what is their role in the future of cryptocurrencies. That's all I can say, Jason. That's a great question.
The last question is, where are we going to have the crossover where we have to deal with CPP in Canada, we have to deal with Social Security in the US, we have to deal with inflation, we have to deal with the millennials and the rising housing prices.
Mm-hmm.
Deal with more people collecting from the system than working in the system. In Canada, we have to deal with how much our good friend Mr. Trudeau has spent, and he doesn't even know how much he spent in the last 2 years that the millennials are going to pay for. When are they going to say enough is enough?
Well, Jason, the demographics are definitely a productivity challenge longer term. Because with the aging population, there is pressure on productivity. So that's another reason why productivity should be in the headlights. You did mention rising house prices. Well, there is a connection between rising house prices and entrepreneurship. Rising house prices do give younger people, millennials, the ability to reach out and start new businesses. And we have seen an unprecedented spike in new business formations since we got into the pandemic. And it's kind of counterintuitive. You wonder about it. But it really does speak to what Mark was talking about, people speaking with their feet and moving on and starting their own businesses. But in the United States, it's remarkable. I think we did talk about it back and forth, the two of us, the number of EIN applications. If you're starting a new corporation, you need an employer identification number in order to file for corporate income tax or business income tax. And the number of EINs has gone dramatically higher. And we can look at EINs, the EINs that are connected with payrolls as well. You can look specifically at those EINs that are going to be job creating EINs. So there's a lot to the system. There's a lot going on. And I guess I would finish off by one point I wanted to make. I've always been interested, as I said, in economic history, and the history of economic progress has been so tied into technology and invention. And in the past, whenever we've seen a new technology introduced, it's often taken decades before it actually has actual application in productivity. And I think that we have seen this time frame really shorten so much in this pandemic situation. We've gone from an application period of decades, 10 years or more, to basically months, I suppose, in terms of the speed at which we've applied the new technology. So that's kind of an around the corner type of answer to a great question.